Hi guys, welcome back. So it is October, and October is the best month of the year for many reasons. One of them being that October is Down Syndrome Awareness Month. And so what I thought would be fun to do for the month of October is to do a little thing where I talk about the questions that I get asked most often about George and his diagnosis. And for the first time kind of use this YouTube channel as something other than like just documenting for me and Kyle, but for kind of a little bit of education, a little bit of advocacy, shouting of his worth, those fun things that we love to do every day, but we talk about it specifically in October. So this is going to be the first part of the Down Syndrome Awareness Month questions segment, and the question that I get asked most often, which is what I'm going to talk about first, is what are George's health issues? So the reason people ask if George has any health issues is that babies with Down syndrome do tend to have a couple of specific health-related concerns. So when people ask me, does George have any health issues, what they're asking is, how is George's heart, how are his intestines, and how is his thyroid are the big ones, and we'll talk about some of the smaller ones. So the short answer is George is a very medically uncomplicated, very healthy baby. So George does not have any heart issues. Heart is number one. About 60% of babies with Down syndrome are born with some kind of congenital heart defect. I have a student that was born with 13 holes in his heart. I know of some kids that had some issues with their heart, but they outgrew them, or X, Y, and Z. So heart issues are very common, and I know that there are so many kids who fight really hard to survive these heart issues, but luckily with early intervention with medical practices, these heart conditions are being treated with a much higher success rate than they were before, and now it's so commonly known that it is a thing with babies with Down syndrome that it gets fixed very easily, which we're very grateful for. George's heart is completely typical. No concerns at all. This was proven by his doctor when he was born, and then our pediatrician double-checked everything when we came home. Heart is great, and that is something that will never change. So another thing people ask me about his heart is, can he develop heart issues? And anybody can, right? But George won't develop any of the heart defects that he would have been born with. So George's heart is very healthy. George's intestines are also very healthy, and that's another very common thing that babies with Down syndrome are born with, sometimes blockages in their intestines and things like that. George was not. So far, we have no reason to believe that George has celiac disease, but celiac disease is very common. George also doesn't have any issues with eating or swallowing when it comes to intestinal stuff, which we're very grateful for, that he's never had any issues eating. He also didn't have any issues when he was born with breastfeeding or anything like that. So intestines and gut health is very good with George. George's thyroid is also very good. So babies with Down syndrome oftentimes have issues with their thyroid developing. Hypothyroidism is very common. And it's very important, and people don't know how important the thyroid is to brain development and just development in general. George's thyroid was checked when he was born, and it's been checked, and it's good so far. That is one that we will keep an eye on forever, because that could fluctuate as he ages. But right now, it's looking like everything is good with his thyroid, which we're really grateful for. So, heart, healthy. Guts, intestines, stomach, business there, healthy. Thyroid, good to go. Those are the big ones that people are talking about when they ask about George's health. There are some smaller ones too. Something that I didn't know until I became a parent to a baby with Down syndrome is that low muscle tone affects their organs as well, which is not something that I necessarily knew. So that can affect his eyes, and that can affect his digestion, which is a little bit different. So some babies with Down syndrome have issues with their eyes because they have low muscle tone, so a lot of them are cross-eyed, or they need glasses or things like that. I waited to film this video because we had George's eye appointment yesterday. George's eyes are perfectly healthy. Selfishly, I kind of hoped that George was going to need glasses. And so obviously I'm very grateful that he doesn't need glasses, but and I'm very grateful that his eyes are as healthy as they are, so his eyes are great. George does, with digestion, oftentimes have issues with constipation because of his low muscle tone in his belly. That's not really a health thing, it's just something to keep in mind. Hi, cat. But we have found ways to work with that. It's never been a huge issue for him. So those are a couple of the smaller ones. There's also one more smaller one. So something that's also very common with babies with Down syndrome is that because they have small nasal passages, when they get sick, it takes them a little while longer to get over it because their nose, like everything is small. Like their sinus passages are just way smaller. When George was 8 weeks old, he got his first cold, and it took a month to get over. And that seemed astronomical in length to us, because it was. But it was because he had these tiny nasal passages, so any phlegm or mucus getting in was not coming out. So that is a thing that has affected George, but that's a very common thing, and that's not a major health risk. So when you think about those small passages, though, it is true for the ears too. And kids and babies and adults with Down syndrome oftentimes have hearing issues. Hearing is the only thing that George is struggling with right now. So we found out that George's eardrums right now aren't moving at all. He did not pass his 6-month hearing test. He passed his birth one, which is crazy, and then he did not pass it at 6 months. And we found out that it is because his eardrums are not moving. They are assuming right now that is because there's fluid on the eardrum, which is very common for babies, period. But it is especially common with babies with Down syndrome because if any fluid gets into their ear ever, because their ear canals are so small, the fluid can't get back out. But that also, however, meant that the doctor couldn't know for sure because she couldn't even see inside his ears. So we will be going back when George is almost 10 months old, so in a few weeks, to get that double checked. The likelihood is that George will need some ear tubes put in to help the fluid keep draining. It's super common. Honestly, my brother, who does not have Down syndrome, needed tubes put in his ears. And what's funny about that is that George has never had an ear infection. And when the ENT looked in his ears, he was like, "Oh, how many ear infections has this poor guy had?" And we're like, none. So that's really the only thing, and they're pretty confident that that will resolve itself as he either ages or gets the tubes put in. And it does not affect, right now he for sure can hear. It's not like he's got no hearing, and he doesn't have any known hearing loss right now because the hearing issues that he does have can be resolved, like I said. But they do suspect right now that George hears everything and it sounds like he's underwater because they think there's fluid in his ear. They also think that's why he screams. George is very screamy, and they think that that's because he can hear crackles in his ear if there's fluid, which is really wild. I never knew that that was a thing. But yeah, so these things sound really scary, but we're really grateful for the advancement of medical knowledge for these things because it has meant that these things kids weren't surviving heart conditions 15 years ago because the doctors didn't know what they were. And they were being thrown into institutions where they couldn't get diagnosed and couldn't get early intervention services to help them. So we are so grateful that these things are just kind of okay now. It's not as scary or big of a deal. That being said, though, we are so very, very grateful and so lucky that George is as healthy as he is. We still would have been healthy with a baby who was sick, though, right? So I say that all the time, that we got so lucky that we got such a healthy baby. But we would have been just as lucky if we had been matched with a baby who was sick, who had heart issues, and who had stomach problems and all those things, right? So the child's worth is not determined by their health. But it just so happens that we got a baby that is medically normal, typical, right? So we go to these extra doctor's appointments as a precaution, but nobody has any concerns. Which obviously as a parent makes my heart very happy. So yeah, his health is really good. So that is the end of our first question. I have a couple more questions that people asked me on Instagram, and I went through and found the most commonly asked questions that I will answer as I can. Some of them I can't answer because a lot of them had to do with my pregnancy with George, and I was never pregnant with George. So, yeah, I will talk about some of the common things. Bobo. Over the next few weeks as we are in October, and I'm very excited. So this month, Down Syndrome Awareness Month, go meet a person with Down syndrome. If you look around in your life and you don't see a person with Down syndrome in your life, fix that, change that. Contact me, get to know George, contact your local Down Syndrome Association, anything you gotta do. It is their month, let them teach you, listen to them, learn from them, and I will see you next time. Bye.